Hello, good afternoon. This is Insight, Raw 1251's premier news show, where we give Warwick students a chance to share their opinions on the biggest news stories of the week, both on and off campus. Before we get started, I want to say just one thing. It's autumn elections this week. I want to say you should exercise your right to go and vote in SU elections for the various committees, faculty reps, and officers that are currently being elected. It's always good to participate in student politics. It's always you should have a say on who's representing you, and so you should go vote. All right. So our top stories today: divided kingdom. A landmark poll last week has shown that the support for Scottish independence has now reached 58% of the Scottish population, compared to the previous support for no in the last referendum, which was 54%. Is the end of the union beckoning, and who's responsible for it? Nicola Sturgeon, Boris Johnson, or coronavirus? Brexit is back in the headlines again as negotiations between the EU and Boris Johnson's government have broken down. It seems we're now heading for a car crash, no deal Brexit. So who's responsible for that? Is the failure on the EU or Boris Johnson? And what does no deal mean for Britain and for you? We'll also be talking about the tier system. Introduced almost to the hour last week. Tier system was sort of facing immediate criticism from northern mayors who feel they're not being given enough financial support, and also Labour, who's now calling for a national circuit breaker lockdown, similar to what's been introduced in Northern Ireland and Wales. Is the system working? And what's happening with cases on Warwick campus as well? That's something we're going to talk about as well. But for our top story, eating at Warwick and off-campus accommodation. If you may have seen earlier that we're putting a poster on news shared, but Warwick has very quietly announced that they are discontinuing eating at Warwick scheme and also their management of off-campus accommodations. So we're going to talk more about what that means for you and what, if anything, is going to be done to replace those schemes. Before we get into any of that, I need to introduce my wonderful panel, starting with Noah.
Hello, Enoch. It's brilliant to be back on Insight once again. And as I was preparing to come on, I recognise this is my 5th week in a row of appearing on Insight. So it's remarkable to be back once again.
5 weeks in a row. I think that's a better streak than I had when I was a guest. So
really? I'm definitely taking that as an achievement. And I've recognised over these Mondays, it's almost as though the government know that Monday is Insight Day, because it seems like every Monday there's always some news that breaks. As you say, last week it was the tier system, and this week it was Michael Gove saying that this no-deal Brexit looks to be like an inevitability almost, which certainly in my perspective is a real concern.
I mean, we'll talk a bit more about no-deal Brexit in a second, but I think so. Obviously, Noah, you've been writing some pieces. What have you been writing? You're a journalist. What have you been writing? What have you written recently? Let's talk about some writing you've done recently. What's going on?
Writing bits for what? I mean, I've been doing bits.
Because your perspective. I know you are keen on UK politics.
Yeah, I've been doing
the whole Brexit situation.
Yeah, I mean, the whole Brexit situation, I just think it is really, concerning. I mean, I've not written personally about Brexit for quite a while, which I must say is an actual relief, because even I, as someone, fascinated by the EU, was getting slightly, bored and finding it a bit tedious. But I think part of it is just negotiation. Both sides will want to really up the sort of tension that's there to try and reach this agreement. But I think part of it is also a recognition that the aims of the two sides are fundamentally incompatible with what they want. And so I think in any future writing I do, it will just be probably trying to look at the 1st of January 2021, which looks set to be the first day of many that could be absolute chaos. Queues at Dover of lorries could just be one part of it. It could also be what medicines aren't available, what food is or isn't available, what security enforcement, security communication is or isn't available. It is sort of the absolute recipe for chaos.
Yeah. Well, speaking of political writers, we have the editor perspectives here with us. Johnny Jenkins, welcome to the stream.
Hi, Enoch. How are you?
I'm good, Johnny. What have you been up to?
I've just been plodding along, starting to work on a dissertation a little bit, doing lectures, lots of work. I do a lot of work in Essex, which has gone into lockdown now, so that's kept me very busy. And just having my say. Yeah,
because I know Perspective had a writers' meeting last week, and from what I said, that was a smashing success. So if you're a Warwick listener out there, how can you get involved in Perspectives?
So Perspectives is the home of student political commentary. It's the Politics Society's magazine. And as you mentioned, we have our writers' meetings regularly. We do print editions. We do online articles most days of the week. You can get involved by searching for Perspectives Writers. It's a group on Facebook, and everything really that you need to know is going to be there. And we'd love for you to write for us soon.
Yeah. Yeah, well, another perspective, right? We've got a sort of a whole row of perspective writers here today because we also have Cam Hall. Cam, welcome to the stream.
Good evening. It's great to be back on Insight.
Oh, I mean, Cam, so you're normally on your other show, aren't you? Because you haven't been on Insight this term. You've been working on the Alternative View. You want to talk about that for a second?
Yes, certainly. So the Alternative View is my little baby, I guess, here on Raw 12:51 AM. It's currently live streaming on Wednesdays 1 till 2. I like to bring on guests from all sorts of backgrounds on campus. We just tend to talk about the things that aren't necessarily in the headlines in the news, and some of the less political things are trying to find the politics where you'd find it potentially less. And of course, with a real focus on some of the stories going around on campus as well. We live stream Wednesdays 1 till 2, and we are republished. We have an audio version that is republished on the Raw, Mixcloud, Spotify, and indeed our own shows, accounts for Mixcloud and Spotify on Saturday evenings as well. But yeah, absolutely loving doing the show, but also great to come on other Raw shows and great to be back here on Insight today.
And it's great to have you back. But you mentioned on-campus stories. There's a bigger on-campus story right now than what's happening with eating at Warwick and off-campus accommodation. So if you've managed to miss this story, essentially what's happened is Warwick has announced that they are discontinuing the Eating at Warwick scheme from March 31st next year, and also they're discontinuing their management of off-campus accommodation from an uncertain point next year, with no plans to introduce a new scheme to replace either of those systems. So I guess just first reaction from the panel, I'll start with you, Johnny. What do you think about this move?
It is quite shocking, and it's shocking in the way it was introduced. It was all done very quietly. Luckily, Raw News spotted it and got on it straight away. They're two separate things. So the Eating at Warwick, they say the system was getting old. It needs a bit of a revamp. This, of course, is a system that gives you 10% off at university outlets and student union outlets. So it saves people an awful lot of money over the years. And before you go to these outlets, it's very normal to top up your Eating at Warwick card so that when you go there, you can get a discounted drink, meal, whatever. It's very disappointing it's going to be scrapped because that saves a lot of people a lot of money over the course of the year. Now, if you buy a coffee, you may only save 30p or something. If you buy a meal, you may save £1. But if you go to these outlets once or twice a week, this is going to start adding up. You are going to start saving quite a lot of money. So very disappointing. Why have they scrapped the Eating at Warwick? Well, I think maybe, it needs a revamp and they don't really want to spend the money. In terms of off-campus accommodation, I think this is really, really out of order because I was in Warwick accommodation last year and I knew that I could trust them. And that if I had a problem, I could go to them and I could trust them to fix it and to look after me rather than look after the interests of the landlord. So I think it's very disappointing they're scrapping this. And again, it must be money. It's a very big team that manage Warwick accommodation. These people, I assume, are going to lose their jobs. If not, they're going to be moved elsewhere. It's very disappointing. And Warwick accommodation is almost a letting agency, if you want to call it that puts the interests of students first. It's so straightforward and it's a very effective scheme. So the news today that we found out they're scrapping it is very disappointing and really puts students at the peril, if you like, of private lenders. And we know the private landlords, and we know they're not always the best.
Yeah. Cam, would you agree with what Johnny's saying there, that Warwick are putting students at peril by banning these schemes?
Well, I think if you look at the two things that I think students really appreciate, I think both Eating at Warwick and Warwick accommodation are two things that students really appreciate having. I can talk from personal experience last year and about Eating at Warwick. So obviously in the copper rooms at Pop, hopefully Pop will return one day very soon. But again, in the copper rooms where you're only allowed to use cash or the Eating at Warwick cards, not only did the Eating at Warwick cards give you a discount, which, if you bought, say, a double shot and a mixer would be 50p, which is priceless, really, but it saved you having to carry cash on you and potentially losing even more money if you lost that cash in the copper rooms. And that's just one example. But the Eating at Warwick card is not only just a student discount, which for many students whose budgets are pressed as it is anyway, having just that little bit of discount is something, as Johnny said, it builds up over the year, and particularly for first years as well, where you want to spend most of your time on campus. If you don't know the area that well, you don't go into Coventry, don't go into Leamington that often, but you want to go somewhere where you can get some cheap food. And the Eating at Warwick scheme allows you to do that. The food at Warwick isn't that expensive anyway, but having that Eating at Warwick card just allows you to enjoy what is, I have to say, some good quality food and drink on our campus outlets, but have it in a much better price for students. And again, it's just little things like that that really contribute to the whole student experience. On Warwick accommodation, now I live in private accommodation in Leamington this year, and I'm really lucky. My landlady's fantastic. She's been on top of everything. But that's not the case, I know, of all landlords in Leamington. And I've heard so many stories from students over the years of appliances being broken down and not being fixed, of mold just being allowed to gather in houses. And again, one of the advantages of Warwick accommodation, where you don't have a deposit, for example, where a landlord can have you at the end of the year, where you have the university managing it on behalf of landlords so they can be more reactive to students. It's their service is to have students. It's something that has many people have seen to be student friendly. And again, you don't get that guarantee with private accommodation. I'm lucky. I know a lot of students aren't. So in many ways, I understand if the university were to say, with coronavirus, we have to make some cuts somewhere. And if we don't want cuts in the teaching experience, which is the most fundamental part of what the university serves, then it may have to be in things like this. But equally, that wider student social experience is vital to your time at university. And I think they've got it wrong on this one, definitely.
Yeah. We've had a comment in from Jacob, but Jacob, we'll get to your question in a second. First, I want to go to you, Noah. Do you agree with what Cam and Johnny are saying?
Well, I think I'm probably more sympathetic to the university than the rest of the panel. I think the main thing to blame here is coronavirus. Coronavirus has economically decimated the finances of universities, both in terms of what they're expected to do in their term 3 of teaching, the accommodation income they're expected to get from their third term, and students that would have expected to come this autumn but instead decided to stay in their countries or just defer a year or not turn up. So it's coronavirus that has meant that these universities are in such dire financial straits. And so, as Cam says, cuts have to be made somewhere, and the most important part of any university is the teaching and is the research. And boy, oh boy, do we need more medical research, not least in finding a vaccine for COVID-19 and any other future pandemics that will arise. I think if cuts have to be made, they probably have been made in the correct place. I didn't actually use Eating at Warwick that often, but I think the main thing about discounts is that they do eventually have to come to an end. If it's 10%, that could be a lot, but actually, most discounts are far higher than that, so I don't think the difference will be that noticeable. And surely one of the key things about being a student is learning how to budget with the price you've got. There are plenty of places around, on campus, the Roots grocery store, which people often say is overpriced. There's Tesco's, a Cannon Park shopping centre nearby, so there is plenty of choice. And so it's clear that, as I say, the technology had been the same for over a decade, and they just had to find a time to bring it to an end. I think if one is the more controversial, it is the off-campus accommodation being scrapped. I'm not in Warwick accommodation. Full disclosure, I'm Cam's housemate, and I can attest to the fact that our landlady is absolutely fantastic, but it's clear that not every landlady is. But I don't think we should bash all landlords the same. Many of them will be brilliant. Renters can also be terrible. And while Warwick accommodation could offer that protection, if there was going to be landlord exploitation, they would only be able to do that within the law. And if they were breaking the laws, that's the sort of thing that would have to be changed by government. A university alone couldn't change that. So while both of these schemes are disappointing for the people that use them or plan to use them in the future, I think the university have made the right decision over where cuts are going to inevitably have to fall.
Well, let's start with Eating at Warwick, and as it were, since I think that's a very simpler part of this whole conversation. Surely, especially as Cam and Johnny have touched on, Noah, in this time where students are really pushed to the brink financially because the economy is really suffering, and social experience is already suffering, the university shouldn't be making it harder to socialise.
Well, I mean, individuals are already being unable to socialise, not because of the university, but because of having to self-isolate if they've been in contact or be with someone else. I think socialising would always be difficult, regardless of whether an extra 10% discount was or wasn't applied. Now, lots of these places, apart from, I say, the Roots grocery store, weren't really, overly expensive anyway. Individuals will have their student loan, which is, of course, means tested based on the, income of their parents. But as I said earlier, a lot of being a student is about budgeting, and that would be the case in or out of a pandemic. And so people will just have to decide to prioritize where they do or don't spend their money and try and find new ways on or off campus to meet people and engage with one another. I think the university can only go so far. It's clear that if they want to prioritize teaching, delivering teaching, ensuring there's funding of tutors, and ensuring there's also funding for new research projects which are so important, they have to recognize that fundamentally they're a university first, not a place of hospitality and leisure.
I want to ask a question now to Johnny and Cam. Surely, sort of flipping question I asked on Noah. Since we are living in coronavirus times, we have to sort of accept that we have to cut down socialization to an extent. Surely this is a good move for the university to encourage people to say, all right, maybe don't go to bars, maybe don't drink as often. It's not quite safe. John, I'll come to you first.
But when does it come in? When does it come into force?
Next March.
Well, there we are. That's when supposedly coronavirus is going to finish. So they're going to keep it, that's when we hope to find a vaccine. So they're going to keep it now whilst we're struggling. So that goes against the point. I think on a far more important point, work accommodation is the one that I know we're going to get onto in a moment, but that's the one that's going to hit students the hardest. And on a far more trivial point, I don't believe that Noah and Cam are in the same house. I want proof. That's what's been on my mind.
I'm not sure there's a way we can prove it unless I literally move my laptop into Noah's room. But
you leave your laptop.
My camera would break at the same point. It is very temperamental.
I give you full permission to run into Noah's room right now. Just to prove.
I need to my door's locked, but I can't believe we're doing this. Right.
I just don't believe it, Enoch. To be fair, it's the same colour walls, isn't it?
They've got white wall. I've got the same colour.
Where's Noah though? No. I want to see both. There he is. Oh, it's so funny.
Yeah.
What did you do with Noah? Oh right.
What was the?
That was quite the experience.
That made my day.
I have to say, that this is the benefits you don't get in the studio. We would never have been able to do this.
Yeah.
You get to see an inside of our inner sanctum now. It's I say we
full radio experience.
All right, well then let's talk about work accommodation then. Surely, even if universities financially struggling, they should still prioritize keeping students safe off campus. No, this is the one for you.
Is it? Sorry, what was the question?
Surely, create chaos. No, I'm asking. Even if the university's budget is squeezed, we have seen several cuts made. Surely that keeping students safe off campus and safe livable homes is crucial.
I mean, of course, and they've still said that while they won't be offering the off-campus accommodation, they have got a phone line in place. There will be things available for students to complain about, dodgy landlords, individuals that aren't providing adequate services. So while their main off-campus scene is being scrapped, I think they said in the press release or whatever, wherever the article was posted, that their full involvement won't completely go away. And obviously it is concerning if there are cases where you do have exploitative landlords, but it's important to remember that it was never the case before that every student lived with Warwick accommodation when they moved off campus in their second and third year. That was only for some cases in Coventry and Leamington. Many people always had to go with a private landlord, a private estate agent, and see whether it went well or didn't go well. So I think it'll be an exaggeration to say that Warwick accommodation previously were helping every student. It was only ever some students.
Yeah. Johnny, Cam will come to you. What do you think about what Noah's point?
Well, I think on the whole point of work accommodation, and I think it's important we touch upon the fact that, again, it's not something that every student gets. And obviously there's more homes in Coventry that were under work accommodation than there were Leamington. But I think one of the advantages of work accommodation is it takes out a lot of the hassle for students who, with private accommodation, particularly when it comes to things like deposits, the length you can sign a contract. And I think the important thing with work accommodation is very much where it's in the university, it's just a lot easier for students. And that's not to say, obviously, people who use private accommodation, that's still fine, people use it. But I think for many students, particularly in their first year, and I think this year in particular, even potentially next year, because we don't know how long these restrictions are going to last, hopefully not too long. But for many students who are moving off campus at the end of this year, and they're going to be needing to have people to move in with, they're going to need to obviously find people and have that sort of thing. It's just more difficult when they've had their social interactions limited this year by COVID, and then they're going to be trying to find houses, and it's all going to be moving towards private landlords, which again, there's a lot more time pressures. It's not as easy, and the market is quite volatile in that sense. One of the things though that concerns me, and this was raised potentially earlier on one of the Facebook groups, one of the posts that was seen, with the Warwick is still can advertise properties to their students. They'll still charge the landlords a fee, but there's a particular line in there which suggests that the whole thing about making homes fit for habitation, that's something that could be going. That would be closing the head lease scheme, potentially in that. That's something that could potentially lead to that. And again, that was posted on the Facebook group earlier. Obviously, that will need to be verified. But I think if the university say that they have this service off campus where they can assess the state of the properties and they can make sure that students are living somewhere safe, then it just is something that is less easy for students. It makes the process of moving off campus harder. But there is a real fear. I think it does leave people at the behest of almost having a good landlord or not. And I think that's something that's definitely concerning, particularly for first years coming off campus as well. Because I can certainly remember the housing process for me being quite stressful last year. You know, I was very ill when people were first going around buying houses. Then in term 2, there was the stress, will you get a good house, will you not? And so work accommodation provided you at least some sort of ease that made the process easier. But again, I don't think it's necessarily bad that people are moving into private accommodation. Private accommodation is still of a very good quality. I can attest to that. But I think we need to make sure that the process is being done in a fairly easy way, I think, for students.
Yeah. I want to raise a comment with you that I saw on the post Ronnie's about earlier. Finally, work accommodation is being shut down. They truly deserve to be shut down after they shafted all off-campus students in 2020. Do we think after work? I mean, it's obviously
I was one of those.
Yeah. Johnny, do you want to talk about your experience of with work accommodation over coronavirus?
Yeah, so I was in Warwick accommodation last year, and I had it was a fantastic house. Everything was as you wanted. It was a bit difficult to arrange a viewing actually originally because you had to arrange it with the students that lived there originally. But other than that, it was all a pretty smooth process. Then we had to go home, as everybody did, for the Easter break, and then never come back really. And there was no question there of any possible refund. It was never going to happen. We were never ever offered any refund, any money back. But I don't think you would if it was a private accommodation. I don't think anyone's going to offer you a refund because they're not going to be able to find someone else to go and live in that house, in that room, in that time, because no one was moving house at the time. So I wasn't too offended by that. I think what Cam says about the stress of finding a house, there will be, believe it or not, what is it, week 3? There will be students now, some first year students who will be starting to think and starting to have murmurings about housing and think we must get it done by Christmas is often a deadline that's set. And whilst that isn't the case, you don't have to get it sorted that early. There is a lot of pressure, and maybe it gets to about week 6 and lots of people start talking about housing. Where are you going to live? Where am I going to live? And as Cam says, it's such a stressful time. And I would say for a first year student, other than being away from home, which of course is very difficult, finding your own housemates to live with in the first place, then finding somewhere for you to live together is an incredibly stressful time. If not, I think one of the most stressful times you can experience in your first year. And Warwick accommodation put you at ease. They said, look, it's going to be okay. And they put on events and they go and tell you this. And they had lots of houses available and it was just so easy. There was such a clear process. And I just think of the students next year or the year after or whatever that aren't going to get that same experience, and I think that's so disappointing.
Yeah. You sort of touched on something there. Your first thing I wanted to discuss. first years this year, no welcome week, locked inside their rooms. Now they're facing losing eating at Warwick and also losing Warwick accommodation. Are freshers bearing too much of the brunt of the coronavirus cuts? Cal, I'll come to you.
Well, I think we have to be honest, and we have to say that there were going to be cuts with coronavirus. There were always going to be cuts. And so I think we have to accept that some things that we potentially liked or we valued as students were going to potentially go. But I'm not sure if these are the right things. Eating at Warwick is something that obviously does cause revenue to be lost from students union and from the university, because obviously the cards give discounts potentially. And of course, there is the option that if you bring in a private high street retailer, for example, like a Wetherspoons on campus, then there could be a contract there that the university could potentially make more money from. And the condition maybe, well, you can't have eating at Warwick. But I don't know. I feel there's nothing in to replace it with value. I still think even in a time like this, students need to be prioritized. And something like Warwick accommodation, again, for something that's so central for students moving off campus, something that makes people feel at ease, something that, as Johnny said, really takes a lot of the stress out of house moving. I think there were other things that could have potentially been looked at on campus. For example, we obviously have a lot of development taking place on campus. Could it have been that some of this development be paused, be reviewed? Obviously, for example, the Arts Centre, the new Humanities building, we can't stop that. That's already building. The cranes were up before COVID. But even so, I think one of the things that's more alarming about this, and one of the things that maybe is why I can't necessarily say what else should have been replaced in these cuts, is because the university haven't really come out and justified why these things have been cut. There's no basis, there's no sort of financial report to say this is the financial hole that we had by getting rid of X and X and X, and we considered these options, but this was ultimately the thing that covered the hole. And so I think until the university comes out with more of a sort of financial justification in terms of this is why we've got rid of these things that a lot of Warwick students value, I think it's very difficult to say if something else could have gone. But I do certainly think without that, these are two things I think students really value and I think will really miss.
Yeah. We're going to get on to Jacob's question in a second, but first, Luke Shortland has given us a comment. I applied for the I applied for the emergency accommodation in first year, and it was such a relief knowing that if I failed to find a place, work accommodation would have sorted me out with a decent place at an affordable price. Also worth noting, Warwick is still going to offer an advertising service to landlords, which means essentially Warwick is still likely to make money for advertising without having to deal with making sure housing is habitable. Shows how little they care about. I presume that would have said students. It's literally too long. I suppose I will sort of put this question to all of you as well. Does this show how little Warwick cares about students? Noah, then Johnny.
Well, as I said earlier, obviously it is terrible. Coronavirus has been terrible. It's been a probably terrible time to be a fresher. Assuming you haven't had to go into self-isolation, not having a proper freshers week, not properly being able to meet your lecturers or seminar tutors, or if you have met your seminar tutors, doing so at a distance. So clearly, it is a terrible year to go to university, and even worse for those that are deferred to start this year and maybe hope to go travelling in their gap year afterwards, only to have that dramatically cancelled. And I obviously, I get the points people say about Warwick accommodation being a form of reassurance, but as I say, it was never to say that they offered, accommodation for all students. It was never fully the case for second year. It was only some that they had available. I think most people went to a private landlord or a private estate agent. And as I say, I think it is wrong to try and lump all landlords as simply being terrible. If there are things that, they should be doing, like things like making homes fit for human habitation, well, it was the government who a few years ago voted against an argument that homes should be fit for human habitation. So a lot of this is not about the university, but what the government do or don't. They're the ones that ultimately have control over housing policy, housing regulation, or what landlords and renters can or can't do. So clearly, I can see why it was a form of reassurance, but at the same time, I think if they're going to have to cut some things, it would probably have to be these over their teaching or research. Otherwise, they'd no longer really be a university at all.
Well, no, the government doesn't set Warwick's own housing policy. Surely Warwick can say that actually houses that it lends to have to be habitable.
Maybe, I mean, I think it is odd that they've said that they've no longer going to sort of, as Cam said, it doesn't need to be verified about houses being fit for human habitation. And clearly, if they are going to still advertise houses, Luke was saying they should be making sure that for the landlords that they're advertising for, there are these regulations in place. So clearly, I think it does need more planning. And I think the sort of they've not really helped themselves with their PR strategy by trying to hide it away. Instead, they should have come out into the open and said, we're going to change this, we're getting rid of this, but instead we are introducing this. Or if they're not going to introduce anything, explain why they're getting rid of those two things, eating at Warwick and off-campus accommodation because of their funding scheme. You know, it should have been far more explained rather than hidden away and left to raw news to find. There was a brilliant scoop, Enoch, on your part.
I mean, to be fair, I want to make this very clear. I did not. Joe Spagnoli, former Raw member, now Warwick alumni, he gave me the information. It's really the scoop credit goes to him. I have to give my journalistic colleague the correct credit. So Joe, thank you so much. Johnny, I'll come to you and ask you the same question. Does this show that Warwick cares more about profits than students?
It just shows they're out of money. They're struggling with cash, and it's not just Warwick accommodation. I've seen lots of evidence, anecdotally and on paper, that they are low on money, and they are making cuts as much as they can. I think it's a long way to go to say it shows how little Warwick care about students, because fundamentally we are their source of income to fund everything else. We are the advert for them. We are the ones they are supposedly here to care about. So I do think they care about students, and I think saying that university doesn't care about students may be a little bit of a stretch. But there's been quite a few questionable things happening recently, and this is just the latest stretch of them. You know, I can handle eating at Warwick going. That's okay. But when it comes to this off-campus accommodation, and as Noah says, look, they don't offer it to every student. We know that. But to those they do offer it to, and those that are able to get those accommodation that are owned by Warwick, it's a brilliant thing. And it's just so straightforward. And having now been in private and Warwick accommodation, I had such a better experience with Warwick accommodation. But to say they don't care about students, I think is quite a stretch.
Yeah. Before we get to Luke's next essay-like comment, we're going to ask Jacob's question first. Jacob Eugene asks, given the assumed losses universities made during COVID year, did a panel foresee these changes as the first batch of future cuts? I want to make clear first, universities already cut certain things, the sessional tutors budget, that cut quite drastically. But yeah, panel, I'll ask you the question, starting with you, Cam. Do you think these are the first batch of even more cuts?
I'm going to predict probably yes. But the problem is, and again, it's the point I raised earlier, we don't know what the state of the university's finances is at the moment. We knew they were going to take a hit with coronavirus, both in the sense that universities, for example, will be making the money out of the conferences that they would have been able to rent out in the summer, make a lot of money from that. And they've got nowhere near the amount of international students coming this year and the significantly higher tuition fees that brings. So we knew they were going to lose money. But the problem is, I think, I'm going to say yes, this is probably the first of a sort of big batch of cuts coming. But the problem is I don't know how much more cuts are coming, because we don't know the state of the university's finances. Obviously, their annual report would give a financial summary. But even in this situation, I think some more clarity from the university, especially given these are such big changes. These are eating at Warwick and off-campus accommodation, Warwick accommodation. They're two big things into part of the student experience at Warwick. And so if there was more clarity from the university going to students and say that here's the situation, here's why we need to do it, here's potentially how much this could save us. Not every student would read it, but just so the information was there would be better. But I do think there are likely to be more cuts coming. And I think it will either be to standalone food outlets. So for example, like the waffle place in the Oculus, or it will be to teaching, learning and research budgets. And I think for the academic experience of the university, I think that would be greatly disturbing. But again, they've cut, I would say, two of the biggest things that they could have done that weren't related to academia. apart from that, it is research and teaching, or it's accommodation and making cuts there, which I think could have potentially even more drastic consequences. So I think, sadly, that I would think this is going to be the first batch of cuts, but I think that the university need to be more transparent about the reasons they're making these cuts, and they need to put students more in the clear that they can feel confident that these cuts aren't going to hit the most fundamental parts of their university experience.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that, Cam. Let's go to Luke Shortland's next comment. I have to say the number of Warwick Com properties has been falling for years now. Everyone had any interest in student issues knew that Warwick wants to end work accommodation. Coronavirus just provided the cover for the university. I personally raised on Facebook close to a year ago. I want to know why there's been so little on this from the SU. Well, I think there's sort of two questions there I want to raise. It's provoked in me. Is firstly, why do you think Warwick tried to slip this out so quietly? They didn't ask any student media. In fact, the post was, I think, the first notification I could find in this story came out on the 15th, and yet there was no proper press release on it. Why do you think Warwick tried to push this out so quietly? Johnny, as our veteran journalist, I'll come to you first.
Well, because no one pushes out bad news, that they bury bad news if they can. It's not just Warwick that do this. Anybody who's got any press or media or PR experience knows that if there's a lot going on and you want to sort of get something out quietly, you bury the bad news and you celebrate the good news. So I'm not shocked that this is the way they've done this, and it's great that Raw have uncovered this. But when were they going to tell us? Were they going to wait until March and then remove those eating at Warwick machines? In fact, they did say they were going to encourage us to use up the money we had on there, which is good. But when were they going to tell us this? February? Were they going to wait until March itself? It's disappointing they've taken so long. Like you say, it's been a few days already. They haven't told us about this, but this is what journalism is here for, to uncover things that they don't want us to know. That's the whole point of it. And so it's good that we've discovered this. It's disappointing, but it's not surprising at all that they didn't tell us about this, because why would they want to tell us about bad news?
Yeah, and I guess that leads to the next question of why have we not seen a response from the SU yet? I'll come to you, Noah.
Well, I'm not sure why there hasn't been a response from the SU. Obviously, there has been lots of animosity towards the SU over their recent endorsement for all online teaching. So clearly, they're not in everyone's good books at the moment. But I think it's like Johnny says, you don't want to promote bad news. It's going to be probably a drip, drip, drip of cuts that are being announced. Now, I think if you're going to have these cuts, which they inevitably need to, because their budget has probably been decimated as a result of the pandemic, you almost need to come out and be open about where these cuts are going to be made, justify why you've chosen to get rid of the eating at Warwick and off-campus accommodation over other things, and where the cuts would have to be made if it wasn't these things. But I think the university are in a bit of a catch-22, because if they don't make these cuts, they're not going to have enough money to properly be an adequate university for future students. If they do make all these cuts on future open days, it won't look like an appealing place for prospective students to come to. Now, I hope a student doesn't decide to go to any university simply because of its eating outlets. I would hope it's be because they've got, a great course with great tutors. But it's undeniable that a part of going to university, especially a campus university where you're not just on, it's not just like in a city where there are restaurants everywhere on a campus. It's a really sort of place of its own. People talk about the Warwick bubble. Their hospitality places are a part of that. So I think whatever the university do, they're always going to receive criticism, and they're always going to be damaged financially. They've got one saving grace, which is that the Arts Centre is planning to reopen from January. Full disclosure, I am a steward at the Arts Centre, or at least I was until it had to shut, sadly, back in March. But that can raise a lot of money. The Warwick Arts Centre, they've got a brilliant, grant from the government, grant or loan, not quite sure which, but they'll be able to run performances there and hopefully raise some income as Coventry becomes the city of culture in 2021. So that's their one saving grace, of some income for conferences and cultural events too.
Yeah, I think we're sort of reaching the end on this story. So, one of the guys, final comments for everyone about this story and what how they feel about the university doing this. I'll start with you, Johnny.
I just think it's getting very dark in Noah's room.
Yeah, I know. It's the topic we're discussing.
Final thoughts is disappointing. I'm far more concerned about Warwick accommodation being scrapped than I am eating at Warwick. But at the end of the day, when it comes to eating at Warwick, this is stopping students saving money. And when it comes to Warwick accommodation, this is putting some students at risk of dodgy landlords. So there's not a good spin on this. As you say, they are going to have to cut money. They're short on money. They're cutting department spending budgets. They're cutting all sorts of things. And this was the latest thing to go. It's a shame. Let's hope that once they're in a better financial situation, they do something about it.
Cam?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say on the point of light, if you watched the Raw Sport broadcast from a couple of weeks ago, you may notice that my room started in total light. By the time it got to 7 o'clock, I underestimated how dark this room got, and I was actually using a desk lamp. And it was like those scenes, you know, in movies where you have the people in the dodgy tents, and you just hold the flashlight up to your face, and it's just one of those scary horror movies. Anyway, I'm digressing right now, but yeah, obviously it's very disappointing. We knew cuts were coming. It's very disappointing to see that the university have made these decisions on two things that, as Johnny pointed out, students really appreciate this. They appreciate having the ability to save money on campus, particularly for first years who are particularly hit hard, I think, by both of these, and especially the off-campus accommodation. As Johnny said, you're putting more students at risk of dodgy landlords. Of course, I'm not describing all landlords collectively, but a few. And so I think if the university is clearly going to go ahead with this, so I think they need to be more transparent about the decisions that they're making and saying that this is why we're having to make these cuts, and maybe more students can support it, and maybe more students, or not necessarily support it, but at least sympathise with the university having to make the cuts. And I think that's something that would really benefit that, with as well as the accountability, is some sort of future plan on both issues. So what are you going to do with eating at work? What are you going to replace it with that still puts students first, whether that is a general price freeze on campus or decreasing prices, or some sort of brand that can keep the prices down and bring in cheaper prices and more variety with the accommodation, maybe something like a landlord registry or something like that. So I think if the university can justify it with transparency on the decision, but also something of value for students, then I think they could possibly be able to get around this.
And last but of course not least, Noah.
Well, as you can see, I have resorted to the desk lamp already, thanks to Johnny's remarks, which I think just shows you how professional my setup really is. As for this whole news, I think it is. It is just very depressing from the university. I think it's a sign of the impact of coronavirus while we were all locked down. Its true effect wasn't, fully noticeable, as in the true economic effect. But now we're actually back at university. It is clear that the cuts that were talked about academically and hypothetically are really now a reality. And so I think they have to make sure that whether it's the university or the SU, they are able to help students as much as possible, looking through contracts and private landlords, checking that there's no sort of nasty clauses or whatever that are going to get people tied into things they don't want to be, and trying to be as transparent and honest as possible. I think it is extremely saddening, but a sad inevitable among everything else.
Yeah. Can I just say on the Noah's Lights comments, Noah, right now your room sort of looks like when I go to visit my grandma in Uganda and the power goes out and we have to have this little torch.
Thank you very much.
That's how we have to light everything.
Yeah, the lights here. You can see the preparation that goes into this.
Now your head on the wall.
Yeah, I know. I noticed that by the time I'm talking. Viewers, they're going to get the full. I mean, it's very like Halloween, but it's an appropriate time of year. Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
At least it's October, so it's not completely bizarre. But I have to work on this next week.
I stole the big window at the front of the house, so
yeah, I know.
It's kind of my fault, really.
No, I actually had to flip my whole desk. I had to move around the whole room just so I could be sat, rather than in front of the window, next to the window, just so I get the barest bit of light. So yeah, I really understand. Let's move on to our next story. Fears for Tears. It's a tiering system put in. You know what, Johnny? I like the pun. The pun titles are going to stay. You can't get rid of the pun titles. They're the centerpiece of the whole show. As you last week, Boris Johnson introduced a new tier system. It's sort of in a polite way. It's met some resistance. But before we get into that, I want to talk about the situation right here in Warwick and Leamington. Johnny, I believe, have some numbers for us.
Yeah, we've got the latest figures in from University of Warwick Test and Trace, which gives us an idea of how many people on campus have corona, how many people off campus have been tested positive. So at the moment, this week, as of today, there are 181 active cases relating to Warwick. Now, this is down 16% as of last week. Last week's figures were very high. So some good news there that it's down, but still a fairly alarming figure of 181 active cases. Of those 181, 103 of them are on campus. That's down 45% from last week. So some good news there. Off campus, a slight rise, 78 off-campus active cases. That's up 169% as of last week. So the message here is that fewer people on campus have coronavirus, fewer on-campus contacts are now having to isolate. But when you get to Coventry and Leamington, more and more people are testing positive through the Warwick test and trace system.
Yeah, I've heard, Johnny, I've heard concerns from people that actually we're seeing it as an underestimation of what's going on in Coventry and Leamington because people aren't getting tested regularly there. Do you think that's an issue?
Well, it's difficult because the first thing to say is if you are a Warwick student and you have symptoms, be that the fever, the new persistent cough, the change in your smell or taste, then you get a test through the Warwick test and trace scheme. And from what I hear, it's effective. I haven't been through it yet myself. And it's quite widely encouraged. And all the seminar tutors and if you've got in-person things are fairly comfortable with you going online and everything. It all seems to be working quite well for me. But maybe the case here is that those that are on campus can get the test and trace on campus easily because they live near Gibbet Hill, which is where the scheme is running. But if you're off campus and you don't have a car and you're in Leamington, then you may not go through Warwick test and trace because you can't get to Gibbet Hill safely because you don't want to get a bus there or anything, and you can't really travel unless you're in a car. So I think that is the big problem here, is that a lot of people in Leamington and Coventry are doing tests through the NHS rather than through test and trace at Warwick, and that might be where we're getting a disparity. The other thing I have heard is that there's a lot of people who refuse to get a test, specifically those on campus that try not to because they're worried about having to isolate for 2 weeks and they're worried about their contacts being traced. Now, that completely undermines the whole test and trace scheme, not just in Warwick, but across the whole UK. If you have the symptoms, you need to get the test and you bear the brunt of the 2-week isolation. It's going to affect us all at some point.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask all of you, what can the university do to get more people to test and trace, to take part in test and trace? Cam, I'll come to you first.
Well, I think the first thing is, and I can speak to this as someone who I know, who I have friends off campus who have been isolating recently, not just here, but at other universities at the moment. And I think one of the things that they've certainly said is that the 2-week isolation is something that is very stigmatized. And obviously it's not good. You don't want to go into isolation for 2 weeks, but I think what people want is they want to feel some sort of support, I think. Or if you can have your 2 weeks off and feel like you're being supported by the university, I think particularly if you're on campus, whether that's the university signposting you to the particular services that they're offering, for example, the home delivery service or the laundry service. If you're off campus, I think it's just the contact. Because I think the thing is with the 2-week isolation, having already been in lockdown for 3 months, I don't think people like that lack of contact. And again, whether that's more societies holding online events, for example, shout out, for example, to Music Theatre Warwick, who did an event last week I went to that was online, and they do a mix of an in-person event and an online event of the same type, so people who are self-isolating can still go and still get some form of contact. So I think people, if they're going to be self-isolating off campus, because ultimately, you want everyone who has coronavirus needs to get a test and they need to be isolating. It's the only way we can get through this pandemic with less lives lost, and we can get through it quicker as well. But I think what we need is for people to be responsible, but also to feel supported. So there isn't the motivation to go outside your house during your 2-week isolation because you're just totally bored and you feel unsupported.
Yeah, before I come to you now, I just want to say, Johnny Jenkins, he has to leave the show now, but Johnny, it's absolutely wonderful having you. You've provided us, you've been a ray of knowledge on this show today, so thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Enoch, and the Johnny Jenkins show is on air Friday, 3 o'clock, right here. See you then. Bye-bye.